That time again. This is when Sally and I take a look at the stories making headlines around the world in our newspaper review. Let's begin with the front pages of the China Daily and the news of the 7.2 magnitude earthquake in eastern Turkey. More than 200 people are dead, with more than 1,000 injured, and a frantic search for survivors continues.
Moving on to the aftermath of the Eurozone debt crisis summit in Brussels, The Guardian is reporting that a row broke out between the French president and the British Prime Minister, when Nicolas Sarkozy told David Cameron he was sick of his criticism and interference.
On the other side of the Atlantic, the worry, according to the International Herald Tribune, is how badly US banks are exposed to the Eurozone debt crisis, especially since the rescue of the Belgian-French bank Dexia.
The Daily Telegraph has the picture of emotional Libyans celebrating the formal declaration of their country's liberation at a ceremony in Benghazi.
And as Libyans celebrated, the Moscow Times reports that Russia has joined the growing international chorus of calls for a full investigation into the death of Muammar Gaddafi.
And finally, computer hackers seem to be capitalizing on the death of the former Libyan dictator by sending out malicious emails claiming to contain a picture of a bloodied Gaddafi, where instead it infects the computers with a software virus.
So much to talk about. Sally and I are joined by Bundeep Rangar, chairman of IndusView. Bundeep, always a pleasure to have you with us. We'll briefly look at Turkey, because what's interesting now is that Turkey's quite resistant to any offers of help. It thinks it can do this by itself because, of course, it dealt with the earthquake in 1999.
1999, when approximately 20,000 people died. You know what? To make a comparison, when India was hit by the tsunami in 2004, it was the first time that India rejected foreign aid. And it was kind of a way to make a statement in the world and say, you know what, we're capable of taking care of our own problems, thank you very much. And kind of a sign of the times saying you're now a rising power and not needing external assistance. This in some ways is similar, although I think there's a little extra twist here when it comes to Israel, because Israel is one of the countries that's offered aid, and as you noticed not so long ago, there was a big diplomatic row following Israel shooting some people that were part of a flotilla of rescue goods into Israel in the occupied territory. So I think there's a little bit of a diplomatic wrangle here as much as there's a political statement.
Well, let's hope that it doesn't impact on people getting help. But let's turn to the Eurozone, as we always do whenever you're here. Maybe this is a side issue, though. David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy having a little bit of a fallout. Nicolas Sarkozy saying, stop interfering.
I guess it's the classical French and British, English kind of, you know, historic disputes that never seem to settle.
That's what you're trying to say, isn't it?
Absolutely. And we were here not so long ago talking about the benefits of fatherhood and how that makes you stress-free. I think here's the other way around. Sarkozy's just, you know, showing the flip side of that. But, you know, to be serious here, I think the fact that you've got 27 members of the European community that are affected by the decisions of 17 members within that, this kind of inner caucus, has valid concern for David Cameron, and he's backed by countries like Poland and Sweden that are not part of that Eurozone, saying, look, if you make decisions that affect our financial services sector, our banking sector, financial transactions taxes being one example, we want to have a say.
And in some ways also, it's not actually even the 17 members, isn't it? It's those two big members, France and Germany.
It's that Franco-German alliance, and I think that's really where the cores of power lie. And going back to the overall kind of, you know, is this a political issue or an economic issue?
Ever get the feeling of deja vu?
Well, every day.
I'll tell you why I say this. Bundeep very kindly brought in, I wonder what your house is like if you keep newspapers this far back. These are the headlines. I'm going to run you through some of these headlines. These are from August. Stock markets plunge worldwide. Interventions fail to ease turmoil. Here's the Wall Street Journal. Italy's struggle weighs on Europe. Sally, what's your second story today?
Italy's having a cabinet meeting, yeah.
Indeed. Calls for a bigger rescue fund. The debt crisis tests the scope of the IMF role. Europe sparks a global sell-off. What's new?
This is something like their 13th summit, isn't it?
Absolutely. It is the 13th summit in, 20 weeks or something. So you've got, I guess, you know, there's no clear political leadership, and it kind of stands in such a big contrast to when you had the financial crisis, the banking crisis in 2008, when Angela Merkel said, we will stand behind any private deposit in German banks, and she set aside 440 billion, and the result of that was a confidence in the banking system, and you didn't have a run on the money a la Northern Rock, and that in fact worked in its favor, and people just said, we have faith in the system. Now you look at this like this is from early August. Things haven't changed, and that already was prolonged. So this lack of confidence and the lack of clear political statement is more damaging than any quantification of what the European rescue bailout fund should look like.
And for example, they've said, that they have agreed on a recapitalization of the banks, but they haven't agreed how. And then, of course, that brings us on to another story here about the US banks being worried about their exposure. We can all agree that we should recapitalize the banks. We can all agree we've got to do something, but it's that detail, isn't it?
And so it's nice to say $108 billion needed for recapitalizing European banks. It's nice to say that, we will use this rescue fund, but they're not leaning on the ECB, the European Central Bank, and there's no plan to actually use leverage or even go after the G20 solution, which is let the BRIC countries find a financial solution to Europe's problems. That is not a bad way to deal with it. But again, we're missing that clear leadership. U.S. banks, by the way, have over $500 billion exposure here. Primarily banks like Citibank and JP Morgan, and that's beginning to come to the attention of U.S. lawmakers.
With this exposure, is it fair, just looking a little closer at this piece, that critics are saying, well, we're going to see a replay of the financial crisis of 2008? Is that a fair assumption?
It is a bit of an extension of a fear factor here, but I've said this before, the danger is Greece becomes the Lehman of Europe and Europe becomes the Lehman of the world. And you really have to arrest this before you see panic selling, and Monday is not a bad day to see where the stock market's going. I'm not sure that they'll be heading in the positive territory.
What would you do if you were there on Wednesday? What would you say to David Cameron and Nicolas Sarkozy?
I would say have surpass your goals. Just make a very, very clear statement to the market. Say, we're not going to let Greece go under, not going to let Italy go under. We'll capitalize as needed, and if need be, borrow from the emerging markets.
Do you know what I'd do? I'd get their heads and put them together. That's what I would do. That's probably why I'm not a world leader in politics. Let's move on. Of course, over the weekend, over the last week, we've seen jubilance in Libya, all across the country with the death of Gaddafi. Are you confident that the country is now in a new positive phase?
I guess the best signal actually came from Tunisia, which is holding its elections for the first time. And as a country that sparked this entire Arab Springs, there's a really good sign of a free and fair elections, and people very proudly displaying their fingers marked with the ink post-voting. Libya is a little different. I think the couple of things need to be resolved around how Gaddafi actually died. And was he killed in the crossfire? Was there an execution-style killing? And that's one of the things that needs to be resolved. Of course, also his burial, because that's getting past due date. The other thing, of course, is what kind of new state emerges from Libya. Is this going to be an Islamic state? That's one fear. Everybody we speak to and hear about says, no, Libya is actually very moderate in terms of its outlook. But the one thing that unites the country past its regional, tribal, and other political affiliations is Islam. And I think to the extent that they have an ascriptive view to Islam, but not a fundamentalist view of Islam, that's actually quite healthy. And I think that the trick will lie in what happens in the next 60 days, 90 days. Does it go Tunisia style, or do we still go into this deadlock a la Egypt, where there's no clear outcome and potential danger?
And I guess that's the problem, isn't it? It's the West must resist that temptation to interfere, because they haven't had a system of democracy. They have had a dictator for the last 40 years or so.
Correct.
So they have to be allowed to find their own ways, and inevitably that means making mistakes.
Absolutely, and that's sort of the teething trouble if you have democracy in a new country. And to its credit, I think the West did a pretty credible job in the way it militarily intervened, but didn't have ground troops. And I think that's a model to emulate politically.
I wonder, I've spoken to many Libyans over the past few days, as we've obviously been covering the death of Gaddafi, and now Russia says it's demanding an investigation into his death. Now, I think internationally we're interested, but when you speak to Libyans, they don't care. They just want the country to move on.
It's a nice way for Russia to get back in the act, right? Because the countries that will be most supported by the new Libya are the ones that supported the ouster of Gaddafi, a la America, Britain, and France. Russia was left out of that. They actually supported Gaddafi until fairly down through the process. Now, in the danger of being sidelined, one way for them to get back in is to kind of take this moral leadership and say, let's find out what happened actually with Gaddafi. But you're absolutely right. People don't care. People are kind of glad they got rid of him, and a tyrant who's been there for 42 years. But this becomes another theater for real politics for international countries. So we'll have to see how it pans out.
What would be your solution to that? Would you feel that the National Transition Council should just put its hands up and say, this is exactly what happened, it was an execution style, or this was exactly what happened?
It's come out.
And that would be an end to it? Or do you think there should be an inquiry that perhaps brings in observers maybe from the UN or NATO?
That's a really tricky one because, there's so much already controversy about whether he died 15 minutes after the first report or was an hour later. I think the larger issue here is what they're doing for sure is making sure people know that he did die. Unlike when Osama bin Laden was captured, one of the big things about that was, did he really die? Why didn't they show proof? Well, here proof is there. There's habeas corpus, and the matter should be put to rest.
And we should just warn viewers not to open their computers because there is a Gaddafi virus circling. We haven't got time to look at it.
His ghost survives in cyberspace.
Oh dear. Bundeep, always a pleasure. Thank you so much. From Sally and myself for the moment, it's goodbye.
Bye-bye.